bias. It's a word that tends to evoke the news these days, but in truth, all of us go into everything we read, research, watch, or otherwise consume with a bias, and scholars are no exception. Scholarly bias is well known even within scholarship, but often not taken into account by folks outside of academia when doing research, especially because certain kinds of bias aren't disclosed openly by historians and classicists the way that scientists have to disclose conflicts of interest. So, what's a recon to do? Let's talk bias and scholarship. Karate. Scholarly bias is one of those things that is often talked about in pagan circles and classic circles as a pre-1980 problem that somehow magically went away in the 90s and double aughts, but in truth is still a major issue to this day. Bias in this case doesn't just refer to the political leanings of the historian, as one would assume if you watch a lot of political YouTube, but it can also include religious bias and preconceived notions due to current cultural or religious attitudes on the part of the academic. To break this down a bit, let's use an example. In my video on what Homer believed about the afterlife, I mentioned that Christian Servanu Inwood's reading Greek culture and reading Greek death, and how they basically overturned decades of scholarly consensus regarding Homer's afterlife. For a brief recap, for decades there was an assumption that due to ancient Minoan artifacts in a script we can't translate, that the afterlife was a glorious place in Crete. But during the so-called Greek Dark Ages, when the region lost writing briefly, those beliefs shifted to an idea of listless shades that lose their autonomy and identity until they're fed the blood offerings by their descendants or just passers-by. It's well known that Homer's compositions came from larger, older epic cycles, and that every poet embellished the stories as time went on. Servanu Inwood exposed the biases of a lot of scholars who predated her work on the topic by showcasing obviously newer passages that showed the shades acting autonomously without an offering of blood, and how the famous blood passages appear to be older parts of the poem linguistically. But the idea of a continuity broken by the Dark Ages was so entrenched in scholarship, they couldn't see the forest of evidence for the trees they thought should be there. She did similar work for the Minoan tomb evidence that I didn't cover in the same volume, but the point is that continuity bias is a major problem in classical studies. Note for all the psychologists in the audience, I know continuity bias is a psychological term, but that's not the context I'm talking about here. Continuity bias is actually the first of the biases that we're going to talk about because it's a very common one pre-1980 and still comes up from time to time in modern work. A lot of scholars like to build on work that came before, which is the natural consequence of science of any kind, and historical studies and archaeology are no exception to this. But building on prior work without questioning the assumptions or methodologies of that work caused a replicability crisis in psychology within the past decade, and we're starting to see the same issue in the classics. Especially pre-1980, a lot of other biases that we'll discuss as we go along ran rampant, and despite flawed methodology colored by said biases, no one thought for a long time to question the conclusions they reached. This resulted in the historical equivalent of a replicability crisis in the classics, and a ton of work coming out of the 90s double aughts, and today seeks to fix these issues and look at things in a more objective manner. This is why you'll see a flood of articles on JSTOR critiquing older work and re-examining a lot of the conclusions initially reached by the old guard like Berkare, Nilsson, Parker, and Seaford. There have also been movements in Greece to get own scholarship more widely recognized internationally, as for a long time there have been assumptions regarding Greek scholars reframing issues to make their modern nation look better or establish continuities where there might not actually be any. We're starting to see some of these assumptions dissolve and more Greek-originating work published in English or French for international historians, but it's still an issue. That said, even the more modern work at times can have a continuity bias or suffer from our next major category of bias, the assumption that our ancestors weren't as smart as we are. I call this ProModern Bias, but basically a lot of scholars like to assume that our ancestors weren't as observant or intelligent as us, and so will discount deep philosophical or scientific truths discovered by ancient societies. A prominent example of this were the Mayan and Aztec astronomical discoveries, charts, and calculations, which were centuries ahead of the European counterparts, but were discounted due to the religious motivations for said calculations. If Galileo wants to go searching through the heavens to find the Christian God, that's fine, because European and also Christian. But when the Mayans created astronomical charts centuries ahead of Europe, it didn't count, because they also used them to predict the future. Also, there was a plant in Rome that went extinct due to overharvesting for its effects as birth control, but the assumption in many books on ancient medicine was that all of it must have just been superstition despite the discovery of aspirin and willow bark and other pharmacologically useful compounds in other traditional plants. Now, I'm not defending fluffy bunnies who claim our ancestors of faith had some secret knowledge that needs to be marketed to the moderns, or that humor theory in ancient Greece had any validity. But when you get entire volumes devoted to how secret psychedelics must have been involved with the Eleusinian mysteries because otherwise a religious experience like that could not have been impactful to the lizard brains of ancient peoples, well, you get the idea. No evidence of this has ever been found, by the by, but it was repeated for decades in subsequent work. Panspermia was just grains and beans in a porridge. We have recipes for it, though incomplete. There was never any reason to believe psychedelics would be required apart from the bias that ancient religion must have been too primitive for a ceremony like that to have an effect on the psyche of those participating. Yay, bias. While discussing the script for this video, my buddy Fire pointed out that Emily Teeter, a prominent Egyptologist, insists that the ancient Egyptians must not have complex esoteric philosophy in their religion, despite the continuity of it existing for over 3 millennia. Her insistence that the Egyptians avoided speculative thought and built their entire worldview on concrete terms and observations is clearly rooted in this kind of bias, the same reasoning often expressed by atheists when they insist that myth only existed because of attempts by the ancients to explain natural phenomena before the advent of science. In ancient Greece, scientific methodology was often employed by philosophers long before the European Enlightenment, yet they still remained polytheist. I wonder why. Welcome to the third major bias that we often encounter in scholarship, the assumption that polytheist religions were simply primitive precursors to either Christianity or enlightened atheism. Take your pick. I'm just gonna call it anti-pagan bias for short, and the 2 flavors of it need to be discussed separately. The first flavor, the pro-Christian bias you often see in scholarship from the 50s and earlier, is the most prominent in philosophy and theological studies. Very little work has been done on interpreting the epics or other works such as comedy and tragedy in a theological light, because there's an assumption that these religions were too primitive and individualistic and variable with their lack of central organization and orthodoxy to have a complex theology. It must be beyond them. Oh, what's that? You brought up Stoic physics or Platonism? The Christians have you covered. Any sign that the philosophers were actually polytheists are discounted as attempts to not be executed for heresy by the governments of whatever city-state their work originated in. Oh, and Plato himself argued for multiple gods, and so did most of their successors. They were just stepping stones on the path to true monotheism, and the prime mover must have been the only god, because why would you need the others to rule the cosmos? They just didn't realize the others were superfluous, that's all. Primitive minds and all that. Oy. Coming back to Egyptology, Emmanuel de Rouge insists that Egypt must have begun as a monotheist and devolved into a polytheist culture over time. The evidence? Well, there's the idea of a divine unity that began everything and divided into other gods through the creation myth, but also, Egyptian society was just too dang complex to actually truly be polytheistic. Only monotheism creates the cultural cohesion to allow for societal advancement after all, because polytheism is just so primitive and unenlightened. Right. This particular example intercepts with ProModern Bias and the desire to see ideas as progressing from primitive to enlightened, simple to complex, rather than the more cyclical nature of ideological evolution the evidence of history actually presents. In scholarly circles, this is referred to as the teleological view of history and is often regarded as a fallacy. The desire to see monotheism in one of the most ancient civilizations we still have easily accessible evidence for has borne both of this bias and the desire for Christians to find some level of biblical accuracy. On the Greek side, the paper that I use most extensively for my votive offering video makes constant disparaging comments about the primitive and unenlightened selfishness of the inscriptions that many of the objects described, judging them as showmanship through the lens of Christian morality. Does this make the description of the items less useful? No, but it does make the paper very annoying to read as a polytheist, and pulls many of the conclusions reached by the author about said objects into question. The flip side of this, excessive scholarly bias, seeks to write the gods out of the very motivations of those who worship them, in order to create seemingly rational explanations for religious behavior. This is evident in many of the works that Parker refutes in his seminal work on miasma, where he goes to bat in defense of a primarily religious motivation for the majority of the cleansing practices rather than just a societal or scientific one. However, nowhere is it stronger than in the work F.S. Neiden sought to recontextualize in Smoke Signals for the Gods, where he put up his dukes against scholars who proclaimed, despite evidence to the contrary in the form of ritual non-meat markets in Athens, that the only time the ancient Greeks ate meat was at communal festivals. So, ritual slaughter must therefore be used to alleviate the guilt of killing animals for meat. Never mind that only very specific animals could be used as sacrifices, as I discussed in detail in my video on offerings, or the fact that animals sent in for these offerings were often rejected for imperfection, or that simple practicality dictated that a lot of those folks would have died from malnutrition out in the boonies if they couldn't make it to every Polis festival. Nope. Guilt from meat murder was their reason for feasting and celebration. Okay? These sorts of biases permeate how modern pagan movements and surviving cultures that still hold their polytheistic roots sacred are discussed by anthropologists even in the present day. Oral history is discounted because it's not written, for example, and many stories from indigenous tribes are amalgamated into simplified, watered-down tellings that distill the essence of the story, eliminating the flair and artistry of individual storytellers from the tribes. Again, it's not in writing, so it doesn't matter. Why preserve the artistry? Who cares? I mean, I do, but, I'm indigenous, so I guess I don't matter in this point. Racial bias also permeates older work, though it's far more subtle when it shows up in modern work. This is especially an issue for heathens looking into information on ancient Norse cultures, as many papers published from the 30s to the 50s had a distinctly, swastika vibe to them. I'll let you connect the dots there. A minor bias for the layperson is simple linguistic bias. Simply put, classicists are often required to learn French and German as part of their studies, but as a layperson who only speaks English, you might hit a wall when you go digging for a paper half your monograph's reference only to discover it was never translated. The assumption that the only people reading these papers are academics plagues their citations. So unless you plan on becoming a polyglot, you might have to rely on what other academics say about these works rather than accessing them yourself. Why translate when everyone already speaks free languages before they put pen to page? So, now we've established that just because a scholar said it, doesn't make it true. What is a recon researching the ancient practices in the hopes of connecting the gods to do? Well, you're already halfway to being able to deal with the bias just by recognizing what kinds of bias are the most common. This includes your own bias as a pagan potentially wanting to romanticize history, such as not wanting to acknowledge the horrendous state of women's rights in ancient Greece, or the practice of human sacrifice in Samaria. These things happened, and they're there. I don't have a magic prescription for figuring out what to discount and what not due to bias other than experience and awareness, but chances are a bias paper whose conclusions are based on those biases will reveal itself over time. The presence of biases doesn't automatically kill the usefulness of a paper either. I still use the one I referenced in my votive offerings video, but I didn't take the author's opinions on the morality and development of the attitudes of the inscriptions as part of that application. The Emily Teeter book I referenced is often cited for the what of ritual praxis, while the why is often contested. It's simply about figuring out what's useful and leaving the rest behind. Experience and referencing more modern works critiquing the older ones can help you parse this out for yourself. Google Scholar has the options to notify you both of existing citations for a paper and the option to alert you of new papers that cite it in the future. So, if you're concerned about bias around a particular work, there can be a way to key into the ongoing conversation around that topic. One rule of thumb: if there are multiple works on a given topic, an accurate view of it is most likely to emerge from reading many works on said topic that argue for the specifics than relying on one particular paper or scholar. As fond as I am of Parker, Servanu, Inwood, and Naiden, reading a wide variety of opinions, and including those that disagree with them, has helped inform my conclusions on the validity of their and other scholars' claims. Ultimately, scholarly consensus and historical evidence is only as authoritative as you choose for it to be in your praxis. If one particular scholar's work resonates with you more than another's, it's fine to base your praxis on that and see how it goes. Ultimately, this is all in service of building relationships with the gods, and it's easy to lose sight of that in the deep muck of historical research. Historical documents aren't a replace for a centralized text like the Bible or some organizing body like the church. Paganism isn't orthodoxic, and even within orthopraxic traditions, some praxis is going to vary between members. It did historically between city-states and eras. What's most important is that making sure historical accuracy doesn't replace orthodoxy or become a barrier between you and building a relationship with the gods. At the end of the day, we're all trying to connect to them, just as the ancients were. Don't forget that. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, write off the subscribe button's opinions and condemn the like for heresy. Drop down into the comments and unleash your horror stories about scholarly and academic bias within your faith. Or just tell me that any scholarly opinion outside of Greece is automatically wrong by existing if that's your speed. I don't know why you're still here if you think that, but thanks for the view and making it this far. Smash the dislike button on your way out if you please. Special thanks also to my incredibly patient patrons who have been waiting for this video for over 3 weeks since I announced it. Both the script and my plans for the topic have changed dramatically over time, and you all stuck with me through it. For that, I thank you. Your contributions are helping me deal with the chaos of the remodels that I need in order to keep the adorable little shit on your screen alive through future heat waves, and have allowed me to get my hands on many of the papers and monographs I trashed in this script. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.